Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest in the Centre's series of leadership lunches. I'm delighted that the Treasurer, Joe Hockey, accepted our invitation to address us today, and even more so that this is his first public talk in Australia as Treasurer. I'd also like to acknowledge here his colleague, Senator Scott Ryan, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Education and a graduate of our Liberty and Society student program some years ago, and also Senator-elect Bob Day from Adelaide, a former board member of the Centres. In a speech last year entitled "The End of the Age of Enlightenment," End of the Age of Entitlement, we had a function last night on the Enlightenment, so we had Enlightenment on the brain. Now we're back to reality with entitlement. Given to the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, an organisation we at CIS know very well, Joe Hockey set out the extent of the problems facing Western democracies. If you haven't read the speech, I urge you to do so. It's on his website. Quotes from it are also starting to appear regularly in articles about the new government and how it might confront the problems we are seeing emerge and that really we have known for a very long time. It's tempting to read you some healthy chunks of his speech because it's really very good. But I'll give you just a couple as a prelude to today's talk. Quote, "The fiscal impact of popular programs must be brought to account no matter what the political values of the government are or how popular a..." Another, "We have seen a battle between the fiscal reality of paying for what you spend set against the expectation of majority public opinion that each generation will receive the same or increased support from the state than their forebears. The entitlements bestowed on tens of millions of people by successive governments, fuelled by short-term electoral cycles and the politics of outbidding your opponents, is, in essence, undermining our ability to ensure democracy, fair representation and economic sustainability for future generations." Ladies and gentlemen, that is the prelude, and today I ask the Treasurer address us on the task ahead. Joe Hockey.
Thank you very much, Greg. To my good mate and parliamentary colleague and fellow traveller, Scott Ryan, who's come up from Melbourne, to someone who's been a great friend of mine for a very long time and whom I have an enormous amount of respect for, Nick Greiner, Senator-elect Bob Day, we have high expectations. Please. I don't want to be too obvious, but Michael Darling, and to you, Greg, it's a great pleasure to be here in my first domestic keynote address as Treasurer. And I want to declare my gratitude to Greg Lindsay and the CIS team for its advocacy of many good values and policies that I share. Initiatives that help facilitate enterprise, empower individuals and nurture consumer sovereignty will always have a page in my playbook. With this in mind, today I'd like to discuss the many challenges the Coalition Economic Team has ahead of us. The work of the CIS will no doubt be of great use as we deliver our plans for the Australian economy. The first few days in the job are reflected by the most common question I get from people on the street. Are you having fun yet? It's no joyride, I can tell you. But my colleagues and I relish the opportunity to help turn things around. We're cleaning up the mess that we inherited. And we are determined, based on sound values, consistent principles and clarity of purpose, to re-empower the community. Our plan is threefold. Firstly, we must be honest about the challenges that we face. Secondly, we must lay down a roadmap that helps us to deal with those challenges. And thirdly, we must harness the support of the nation as we follow the roadmap, notwithstanding the obstacles that will be put in our way. Firstly, the challenges. Australia has enjoyed a remarkable period of prosperity and continuous growth for over 2 decades. Some people attribute that to overseas demand for our resources, but that has only really been a factor for the past decade. Much more important has been the series of economic reforms in the 1980s and 90s, and in the early part of this century by both sides of politics. These reforms lessened government control and regulation and unleash the power of the private sector and the market. These reforms shaped a more dynamic and adaptable economy that stood us in good stead to handle the shocks of the Asian and then the global financial crisis. As a wise man once said to me, and he's still my father and he's still wise, he said, "The trees with the deepest roots are best able to withstand the worst storms." These reforms from previous governments created the deep roots and were a testament to the power of economic rationalism. Distortions in the economy were fearlessly addressed through initiatives like tariff reductions and national competition policy, and freedom of choice to determine production and allocation decisions was delivered through workplace reform and financial services deregulation. The reforms made people and businesses accountable for their actions. Importantly, Australians were able to own the rewards when they made the right calls. This base strengthened the economy and ensured that government could sustainably afford the healthcare, the education and a welfare safety net that Australians expect. In short, the reform and the effort undertaken yesterday paid for today's quality of life. Recently, we entered turbulent times, in better shape than many of our peers. We had surplus budgets, no net debt, full employment, rising real wages, and historically high and rising terms of trade. However, since 2008, we have experienced a period of significant dislocation. External factors have reshaped our destiny. Public policy incompetence has worsened the impact of that dislocation. As we emerge from the worst of the global financial crisis, we have rising unemployment, deteriorating debt, declining terms of trade, and structural challenges in our budget that need to be urgently addressed. Global challenges remain, but they are not insurmountable. In the next 12 months, the identifiable risks on the horizon include the impact of monetary policy tapering in the United States and the impact of revelations about the health or otherwise of European banks by the ECB. Of course, the third significant risk is where the United States Congress will end up on its new debt limit debate in mid-term election year. Now, your guess on that is probably a lot better than mine, and I was just there. I am, for numerous reasons, less concerned about a domestic downturn in China. What I am sure of, however, is that we cannot allow any of these events to influence us unduly. We must prepare ourselves for the risk that they might turn out for the worst. So what do we do? Well, the Commonwealth budget remains in poor shape. In the 18 months since the 2012 budget was delivered, there has been a $95 billion deterioration in the bottom line across the forward estimates. And that is only on the published figures released so far. When I release the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, Australians will see the true state of the books that we have inherited, and I know that the story will be worse. It has been more of a disappointment than a surprise that overly optimistic forecasts over recent years have raised hopes only to be dashed by backfilling angst. Consumers and businesses who have rushed to strengthen their own balance sheets have been far smarter than the prior government, who have overpromised and underdelivered on the budget recovery. So the community is now far better prepared for the future than the government is. But it's not just fiscal ineptitude that has let us down. Massive re-regulation of the workplace, claims for global leadership in areas where the globe did not want to go, and chaotic and dysfunctional policies in areas from trade and taxation through to international relations, Commonwealth-state relations, has sapped the confidence of the nation. But confidence is coming back. The share market is around 5-year highs and the property market is gaining confidence. Retail sales have lifted and business confidence is rising. It's not all rosy, but the trend is encouraging. And whilst the continuing surge in resources exports will support growth, the rest of the economy must now step up to the plate to fill the gap. So much of our resurgence rests on improving our productivity growth. We are currently lagging, not only behind the rest of the world, but also behind our own record. At the same time, our participation rate is falling, largely due to the ageing of the population. And an ageing population means rising costs in healthcare, aged care, pensions, and so on. But I want to say again, these are not insurmountable challenges. For a nation that is as ambitious and innovative as Australia, we can make good. So Australia must first and foremost focus on building economic growth. Strong economic growth in partnership with more prudent and focused public sector spending will be the key to improving our standard of living. It is our best chance of returning the budget to surplus and paying down our record debt. High prices for Australia's key commodities over the past decade sparked the largest boom in mining investment in Australia's history, but the boom is now tapering. Mining investment is currently expected to fall sharply from 2014-15 as major resource projects are completed. I expect that the difference between a tapering and an investment cliff will largely rest on the performance of our trading partners. And this is one of the reasons why the Prime Minister and the Minister for Trade, Andrew Robb, are moving with great haste to expedite new trade agreements with Japan, Korea and China in particular. And like a business, a country with a growing demand for its products is best placed to improve its balance sheet. Of course, we need new investment to develop our nation's products, and a welcoming approach to foreign investment is essential in that regard. It's worth reminding ourselves that each year we need $40 to $50 billion of net additional foreign investment just to fund our lifestyles through our current account. This foreign investment has been a key driver of our economic growth since 1788. We need foreign investment, and whilst it may be plentiful now despite a relatively high Australian dollar, as interest rates recover around the world to more normal levels, we'll have to fight hard for that investment, particularly in our region. So I do want to send the message that Australia is most definitely open for business, but we need to see high household spending and growth in business investment in services, manufacturing and the rural sector. Of course, the growth challenge is complicated by the inevitable fall in the terms of trade. The remarkable expansion of the Chinese and other Asian economies drove an unprecedented increase in our terms of trade, which in 2011 peaked at the highest level in 140 years. Since the peak, they've fallen 14%, and they're expected to continue to fall as growth in the new supply capacity continues to outpace growth in demand. These forces will lead to a substantial slowing in growth of national income. Now, I want to give you a different perspective. National output per head of population has increased at an average annual rate of around 2% over the last 3 decades. National income per person has only declined twice in the last 20 years. Once was 2009-10, when GNI income per head declined by 1.2% directly after the global financial crisis. But the second fall was last year. In 2012-13, the terms of trade fell by 10%, and as a result, per capita incomes fell by 0.75%. So with the ebbing of the terms of trade, growth in productivity will more than ever determine our growth and our living standards. So if we don't start moving now, we could face a very lean decade ahead. If productivity growth matches its average over the past 3 decades, we may see growth in income per capita slow to less than 0.75 percentage point per year, around a third of what we've enjoyed since the 1980s. There could be periods where living standards actually decline. We don't want that. If we want to sustain national income growth at its 30-year average, there'll have to be a significant lift in productivity growth. We will have to lift annual productivity growth to over 3% a year. And that's significantly more than the long-run average, higher than the productivity growth that was achieved in Australia in the 1990s following the 1980s reforms. So maintaining historical increases in our standard of living will require a very big effort. That is, to maintain our current standard of living, we now have to do the heavy lifting. That's not something many of my predecessors have had to deliver in the first few weeks in the job. So the growth challenge is not an abstraction, it has implications for every Australian. And it's not uniquely Australian. It is the preeminent global challenge facing both developed and emerging economies over the coming decades. And this is something that the Prime Minister and I will focus on in our G20 host year, which commences in just under a month's time. Obviously, what we need now, and what the world needs now, is economic growth. It is the only way out of the global slump of confidence. It's the only way for governments to undertake sustainable fiscal repair. And it's the only way to get the unemployment queues to shrink. It is the only way for people to be lifted out of poverty across our region and here in Australia. Our G20 agenda also includes liberalising trade flows, measures to improve the integrity of the global taxation system, financial system stability, and a commitment to remove impediments to private sector investment, especially in essential infrastructure. The second economic challenge is our changing demographics. Our population, like that of most developed nations, is ageing. In recent decades, Australia has benefited from what economists call the demographic dividend, when increases in the number of people working age outpaces the number who are either too old or too young. But many of those baby boom workers, and there's a few in the audience here, are now scaling back their work hours as they move towards well-earned retirement. That's you, Greg. He was just telling me 9-day fortnights. Labour force participation rates are in decline. The number of workers available to support those who do not work is also falling. The Intergenerational Report in 2010 projected that the proportion of people over 65 will increase from 13% to nearly 25% of the population by 2050. And this is the interesting one. The report also found that working age to retirement age ratio had fallen from 7.2 workers to 1 in retirement in 1970 to 5 workers to 1 in retirement in 2010 to 2.7 workers to 1 in retirement by 2050. At the same time, spending on older Australians is rising, with increased spending on health and income support. Some of that's privately funded, but there's obviously an increasing call on the budget. Treasury estimates show that without restraint, real growth in government payments will average around 3.5% per annum between 2017 and 2024. Combined social security, welfare, health and education spending. Social security, health, welfare and education spending will be over 80% of the government's expenditure growth in the 10 years to 2023. That's before infrastructure, defence, a range of other areas. Unless we change our ways, the size of government will keep increasing upwards and upwards. We can't afford to get to the level of social expenditure seen in European countries of around 25% of GDP. According to the OECD, we're around 18%, but it is a slippery slope. That's why we've committed to reining in spending, reducing the tax burden on business and taxpayers, and overall reducing the size of government. Which brings me to the next challenge, the fiscal one. Over the past 6 years, we've experienced the most serious deterioration in the budget and the fastest increase in government debt in peacetime history. More damage has been done to the fiscal fabric of the nation than any other modern government ever. So this is the most serious failure of public policy I can recall. And it wasn't just a shortfall in revenue, the problem was excessive spending. For example, in its first year of operation, the mining tax raised less than 10% of the originally announced proceeds. Yet the previous government locked in an extra $13.5 billion of expenditure against a tax that didn't raise the money. As each day passes, from the other side of the House, Labor is still determined to damage the budget, with their opposition to our reforms. And from opposition, they're arguing that there's some sort of policy equivalence between a tax they announced but never legislated in April this year on superannuation pensions, which they claimed would raise $313 million but could not be implemented, compared with an unfunded $3.7 billion co-payment on superannuation for lower income Australians that they themselves would have got rid of. So they're arguing there's some policy equivalent between an expenditure of $313 million, a saving of $330 million, and a saving of nearly $4 billion. There's no policy equivalence, there's no fiscal equivalence. Fiscal sustainability must be addressed. It will require eliminating waste and mismanagement. It will involve winding back spending. And a key part of our job will be starting the national conversation. We will deliver sustainable budget surpluses on average over the next decade, building to 1% of GDP by 2023. Now, for a few of the journalists in the room that may take that last statement out of context, I want to say we're going to get to surplus before then. That's how big the surplus has got to be. Sustainable fiscal policy promotes good macroeconomic outcomes, and we are determined to have a credible, transparent and effective strategy. I note that the CIS Target 30 campaign has the same ultimate goal of restraining government's share of the economy, and I commend you for it. So what's the roadmap? We face a number of challenges, and we have to roll out the roadmap to deal with them. We will cut taxes, eliminating the carbon and mining taxes. We're cutting the company tax rate. We're delivering personal income tax cuts without the carbon tax. We'll reduce the burden of regulation on individuals and businesses. And just today, as I speak, the Prime Minister is on his feet, confirming the government's commitment to reduce the cost of unnecessary and inefficient regulation on business by $1 billion each year, every year. And we've just started the clean-up. We have to get rid of agencies that are not doing their job or are only adding to the red tape burden that people have to deal with. But there's an enormous amount of work to do. In opposition, we began identifying savings that would make the budget $7 billion better off. It's a good start from opposition. You've still got to win an election. But our Commission of Audit will review the government from the top down, program by program, to ensure the services and income support Australians need are provided as efficiently as possible. It will lay down a roadmap to eliminate duplication and overlaps between levels of government. The Commission's very ably led by Tony Shepherd, who's been the chairman of the Business Council of Australia. He understands these things, and he's got a great team behind him, including Dr. Peter Boxall, who is here, and has promised me he won't go soft. Tony Cole. Peter Boxall was the former head of Secretary of the Department of Finance. Tony Cole, former Secretary of the Treasury. Rob Fisher, a former senior public servant from Western Australia, and Amanda Vanstone, who for 7 years held a range of different portfolios. This is the first step, and its report will be a huge part of our first budget in May next year. The second area, expenditure, is one part of the story. The other is, of course, revenue. This week I announced the inherited backlog of 96 announced but unlegislated taxation and superannuation changes dating back to 2001. 2001, 96. And they're going to be fully determined by the 1st of December, a few weeks' time. A number of meaningless and unimplementable tax changes are being dumped. Moreover, tax changes that are of no net benefit to the community or the economy, such as changes to FBT rules and self-education, have also been dumped. We are committed to abolishing the mining and carbon tax, and the legislation is a first order of business when the Parliament meets for the first time next week. Both taxes hamper our international competitiveness. Both create structural holes in the budget because the Labor Party spent more against the tax than the tax was raising. And I urge both the Labor Party and the Greens to respect our mandate and vote to repeal the corrosive taxes. Getting rid of them will improve economic growth. They'll make us globally more competitive and more affordable. But they alone will not deliver the stability in relation to taxation policy. We are absolutely determined in government to avoid knee-jerk rule changes in taxation policy that too often disrupt the confidence of capital flows right across the economy. Like everything, we cannot ignore the medium-term challenges. We are committed to producing a tax white paper that will lay down the taxation reform program in harmony with our core principles of fairness and simplicity. And we are serious about the contribution tax reform must make to improving productivity. We'll then ask the Australian people to endorse our plan at the 2016 election. So what I'm offering the Australian community today is stability for a number of years in relation to taxation policy. In order to drive economic growth, we need to ensure that we improve our productive capacity. Now, more than ever, we must retool our nation for the economy that we want to be tomorrow. We must build the modern infrastructure we need. And building the right infrastructure in the right places at the right price is hard work. It's easy to dream new infrastructure, and Nick Greiner knows that. And it's exciting to announce, particularly for a politician, announce new infrastructure. That's fantastic. But serious infrastructure is hard to build, and it's very expensive to pay for. We all know that Australia's infrastructure has not kept pace with demand. That's why we are announcing a significant infrastructure platform, fast-tracking essential programs, increasing funding so that we can start building the transport infrastructure of the 21st century, alleviating congestion in our cities, linking our regions, improving business productivity. Our infrastructure agenda includes over $20 billion in new and upgraded infrastructure projects, including an investment of also almost $5 billion of additional funding over the forward estimates. We also know that governments do not have the capacity to fund all of our infrastructure requirements, with estimates that our infrastructure deficit here in Australia ranges from $200 billion to $800 billion. So it's up to you guys to fill the gap. And that's not through tax, that's through considered investment. Australia must find ways to encourage and facilitate more private sector investment. Soon, with the Assistant Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development, I'll be announcing a Productivity Commission inquiry to look at ways to bring down the cost of delivering infrastructure, including facilitating greater private sector involvement in those major projects. That's the basis upon which we will build a constructive partnership with the private sector. We're going to have a lot of announcements on infrastructure, focusing on building a new partnership with our state colleagues, which we'll be announcing over the coming months, as well as innovative funding models, credible pipeline of work, and rigorous cost-benefit processes that will underpin our growth plan. Our determination is to build productive infrastructure for decades ahead. And as I say, now's the time to retool the nation, whilst money is accessible and affordable, particularly from the private sector. We will boost economic growth, create the jobs, and deliver the productivity improvements by getting on with that. I'd like to touch on two other issues. Along with building forward-looking physical infrastructure, we've got to build economic infrastructure that meets the challenges of the years ahead. Over the course of next year, we'll hold two significant inquiries, and they will be our key economic drivers for change in financial services and competition policy. The last financial system inquiry, the Wallace Inquiry, was held 16 years ago. And there have been dramatic changes in financial services since then. Whilst our regulators, the Reserve Bank, APRA and ASIC, have served us well, it's always good to have a bit of a oil and grease change and check up on them. But that's not the main driver for our inquiry. The GFC exposed our vulnerability to offshore shocks. Accordingly, a key focus of the inquiry will be addressing the long-term challenge for our nation to sustainably fund its economic growth. Moreover, we must recognise and prepare for a new era of global, technological and regulatory change in financial services that will influence stakeholder behaviours. We can either allow ourselves to become victims of change, or else we can build the financial infrastructure that helps us to benefit from that change. I'll be releasing the draft terms of reference for this inquiry before the end of the year, but I can tell you now they'll be pretty broad. This will allow the inquiry to chart a course for the financial system over the next decade and beyond. And to maintain certainty during the course of the inquiry, there'll be a moratorium on significant new financial sector regulation. Hear, hear. Competition. Second major health check will be a comprehensive root and branch review of the competition policies. Now, this review will not just focus on the competition laws. It will identify ways that we can deliver greater competition throughout the economy. Of course, competition is a key driver of efficiency and innovation. Unlocking competition in sectors where it's lacking or weak will deliver significant productivity benefits. And I praise the national competition policy reforms of the 1990s. They delivered lasting improvements to our economy. Many of the lessons of that reform need to be heeded, but there were also some damn good processes that they had that helped to facilitate real change. In addition, we are currently looking very carefully at the car industry in Australia, which is not an easy issue to deal with. And I might add, we are also going to have a very close look at childcare services and, of course, the Fair Work laws. So the third plank is the shortest in a sense, but it's the one that's most meaningful. How do we deliver? First, identify the problem. Second, have the roadmap. Third, deliver. And we're mindful that our predecessors had a lot of reviews, a lot of effort put in by everyone, but very limited outcomes, and that weighs heavily on our minds. But ultimately, you will judge us on what we deliver rather than what we promise. It's just 52 days since the government was sworn into office. In that time, in the Treasury portfolio, we've drafted legislation to repeal the carbon tax and the mining tax. We've drafted legislation to close down the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, relies on $10 billion of taxpayers' borrowings. We're dealing with a budget emergency by identifying where the bodies are buried. From a $100 million plus shortfall in funding for the ACCC, which runs out of money in April next year. I know some of you will cheer about that, but it's still got a job to do. Through to the prudent $8.8 billion grant that we've given the Reserve Bank Reserve Fund. We're dealing with all the legacy issues. Regrettably, I've got to deal with Labor's unwillingness to deal with the debt limit that now needs to go up to $500 billion and 96 unlegislated tax and super changes, as I mentioned. The budget challenge remains a significant clean-up job. In just 3 weeks, Australia takes the chair of the G20. I get to chair the World Finance Ministers. I must admit, I underestimated the size of the G20 leadership task. But the government left us with over $400 million as the bill to run the G20 next year. It's quite a lot of money for the meetings that are held, but I do want to declare we are determined to make it a success, and it's a challenge that we are up for. The first major event will be the G20 Finance Ministers meeting here in Sydney in 3 months' time. A clear and deliverable agenda will be the focus of our leadership. Ultimately, like everything else, we can only be measured by what we achieve rather than what we promise. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you're relieved. I conclude where I began. The values we have as a government will be the solid foundations for our decision-making. The Coalition knows that the wealth and prosperity of the nation are created by the private sector. Our approach to government is to do all we can to unleash the power of the individual and of private enterprise. Government and business must work together to boost productivity, to keep living standards not only where they are, but aim to rise them. Under the Coalition, Canberra must become a facilitator for private sector growth, rather than a punitive and unpredictable interrupter at a time when certainty is already fragile. Our government's made a strong start, but there's much to be done. We look forward to building on our new community and business partnerships over the days and hopefully many years to come. Thank you very much.